Hi, I'm Dora Raymaker, and welcome to my talk, Autism and Skilled Employment, Lessons from Employees, Supervisors, and Support Professionals. So I am a research assistant professor at Portland State University's Regional Research Institute for Human Services inside the School of Social Work. I'm also the co-director of the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, which I will talk more about. I do community-based participatory research with the autistic disability and mental health communities. And I am a applied social services researcher. I do research around interventions that happen inside of the community. And my goal is always science for social change. So today I'm going to talk with you about first a bit about ASPIRE and community-based participatory research and what that is, and then we'll get into the study itself, which is ASPIRE's skilled employment study. And I will tell you about people's workplace experiences, indicators of successful employment, barriers and facilitators to successful employment, strategies and advice that we learned about from our participants, and then we'll do a little bit of wrap up. So throughout this entire session, I am available to you on the chat. So anytime that you have a question or you want to talk to me about this or about anything, just type it into the chat and I'll be there. And if you have trouble multitasking between the chat and attending to the presentation, at the end, there's a slide that has my contact information. So you can email me to get additional questions answered. Okay, so I'm going to just start by talking a bit about ASPIRE and community-based participatory research and what that is and why you might want to do it. So ASPIRE is the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, and it's a research group that I founded with my fabulous collaborator, Christina Nicolaitis, all the way back in 2006. And at the time, I was a graduate student and I was actually studying, I wanted to work on robot brains. So I was in a very, very different field at the time, but because I am also an autistic person and she is the parent of an autistic person, we were on the same listserv. And she got kind of interested in me and decided she wanted to meet me. So she did this very clever thing to lure me into a social interaction, which was to create this autism journal club where we would read research articles and talk about them. But we ended up having just a lot of complaints about the articles that we read. One of the things we found was that a lot of the research was just not relevant or useful to us in the real world. There were a lot of issues with research design. So like instructions for a study that the participants probably misinterpreted because they were written in a way that was too figurative or vague. That would just compromise the entire study. There were stigmatizing questions, there was stigmatizing language, and then the dissemination was really bad. And kind of one of the things that really tipped us over was an article that concluded at the end, and this was a conclusion by the press, not in the paper, that autistic people have no imaginations, which if you know any of us, you know that is most certainly not the case. So there was a lot of potential harm coming out of science. And she and I really quickly decided that we didn't want to complain about this. We wanted to do something. Unfortunately, at the time, Christina was already doing community-based participatory research with the African American and Latina communities locally. So she knew about this. And CBPR is a form of action research, which has been around since the 40s. And the idea is that you include people who are typically the researched as co-researchers. And the action part is that it's research for the purpose of action. It's supposed to do something. It's supposed to create a change somewhere in the world. And there's a million different flavors of action research and participatory action research, and it's really expanded over the years. But CBPR specifically comes out of public health, and it was intended to address these kinds of inequities and the sort of oppression that research can actually help perpetuate. It has 4 considerations for emancipatory practice. 1 is participation, 2 is knowledge creation, so you're making things. 3 is attention to power, and 4 is praxis. So it's got to have a practical application. And there are 9 principles to CBPR. The first is to acknowledge the community as a unit of identity. So this was about acknowledging that the autistic community exists, that we have our own language, culture, shared experiences, and protection and mutual support of each other. CBPR builds on the strengths and resources of the community. It facilitates a collaborative, equitable partnership in all phases of the research. So this doesn't mean that everybody does the same thing, but that everybody is valued and respected and contributes in their way equally throughout the entire process. It fosters co-learning and capacity building among all partners. So this is everybody learning from each other. It balances knowledge generation and intervention for the mutual benefit of all partners. So this has to pay back to the community as well as being good for the researchers. It needs to attend to both local relevance and ecological perspectives. So it takes a systems view. It develops systems using a cyclical and iterative process. So we're constantly learning. It's got that learning organization idea behind it and constantly changing and adapting to meet needs. And disseminate results to all partners and involve all partners in dissemination, right? These are things that help with some of those problems that we were seeing of research being disseminated in a stigmatizing way. And commit to a long-term process and group sustainability, because this is really, really hard work to actually do, to build trust, to work between groups that have historical harms. So once you actually get it going, it's good to just try to keep it going for as long as you can. In CBPR, community members are co-researchers at every phase of the research, and lived experience and community knowledge is respected on the same level as academic expertise. Again, we're not trying to turn community partners into statisticians. That's not what they're bringing. The statistician is bringing that expertise. What they're bringing is lived experience and knowledge of the community's needs and priorities, and what it's just like to be an autistic person. So what's that look like? So in the middle of this diagram, there's the 3 stages of research: development, implementation, and dissemination. And the community throughout every single one of those phases makes sure that the research is respectful, accessible, and socially relevant. And the academic scientists keep the research scientifically sound and academically relevant. So everybody is contributing the piece that they hold, not trying to do the other's part. And that is pervasive throughout the entire study. So ASPIRE, we have now been together for 15 years running, which is kind of amazing to me. And I'm very, very proud of these people. We're a team made up of academic researchers, autistic people, family members, healthcare providers, and disability service professionals. We have connections to a number of different educational and community institutes, and just assume that everything that you hear here, ASPIRE community partners were involved in all of this. And I've included a picture here of the last time we were able to have an in-person retreat back in 2019, and we're hoping that we'll be able to do that again because we love being able to get together. So we have 4 areas of active research right now. One is autism and skilled employment, which is this talk. This is an area that I lead the research in. Then we also have some studies on mental health and wellness. Specifically, there's an autistic burnout study that I lead. And then we're very excited. We're just starting up a new suicide prevention project from Ann Kirby. And that is just beginning. We're so happy to be able to do that work. We have the healthcare project, which is our first project that is still ongoing. Christina leads that. And there's multiple healthcare studies. We also created the ASPIRE Healthcare Toolkit and Autism Healthcare Accommodations Tool, which you can get to from autismandhealth.org. And we are currently working, Christina is leading a really big project on autistic patient reported outcome measures or outcomes and this is a very large study to adapt and test a set of measures instrument surveys to use in health services research, and they're focused on adult outcomes. So these are things that we care about in terms of adult life outcomes, and just to get those to really be good instruments and standardize them for others to use. Okay, so that's ASPIRE and CBPR in that frame, and I'm going to start talking now very specifically about our skilled employment study. So I'm sure all of you already know that employment is a very high priority for autistic adults, families, providers, for everyone. You probably already know also that it's an area that has a high need. This is some statistics from the Drexel Autism Institute from 2017, where of autistic adults 18 to 64 who received developmental disability services, only 14% had a paid job in the community. So this is a huge problem. But this is about not all of employment, but skilled employment specifically. And just to define that so we know what we're talking about throughout all of this, we are defining it as employment jobs that require specialized training or certification beyond what can be taught in the first few weeks on the job. So it's not any particular type of job. It could be in any field. It can be arts, trades, health services, athletics, anything. But it needs to be something that you can't just walk in as entry level and be able to do with some training. You've got to come in already having a skill set to do the work. And this might be through education, it might be through internships, it might be through just the stuff you do in your spare time, but it needs that extra skill. So why am I interested in this? First of all, most autism or disability programs really focus on entry-level positions. When they don't, it's often focused around information technology or data management. There's all of those corporate programs like Microsoft at Work. But less is known about skilled settings more broadly, like what do we know about ballet? And there may need to be different strategies for getting people into jobs that have a skilled focus. We also know that there's a high rate of education in the autistic population versus a low rate of employment. It's a disparity much greater than for the general population. So this study it's a qualitative study, so it was interviews, and it aimed to take a CBPR approach to first understand the experiences of employees on the autism spectrum, and we wanted to understand from at least half of whom had self-identified as having been successful in a skilled job, and from their supervisors or support professionals like job coaches. And we wanted to identify areas that could inform an effective intervention and then develop a concrete specific intervention plan. And what I'm going to be talking to you about through the rest of this talk is really that aim one, which is what did we learn and how can that be useful to you? So the study design, we had 3 groups of people that we talked to. There were the employees and job seekers and supervisors and job coaches. And we made sure we had a few pairs so that we talked to the employee and their supervisor kind of idea. And then we also talked to some key informants. So these were people who had higher systems level views of employment. So it was, people from vocational rehabilitation or from disability employment policy, those types of larger views. And we analyzed the data to understand what was happening and how all of the complex parts of employment relate to each other in order to learn what might help people be more successful in finding and keeping skilled work and being happy and satisfied with their jobs. So we, for our employees and supervisors, it was a national sample. Everybody needed to be, or they needed to have worked or looked for a job in the US, and that was just because of the peculiar nature of, work here has its own stuff. People also needed to self-identify as having an official, either medical or educational diagnosis on the autism spectrum. Again, specific to our employment systems. They needed to have specialized training or be seeking or have professional employment. So either they needed to have the training to do the job or they needed to be in the job already, 18 and older. And then for that supervisor sample, those people needed to have supervised or supported an adult with an official medical or educational diagnosis in a professional setting. And we recruited through word of mouth, social media, and networking. And then we had, my university got like oddly enamored of this study, and I ended up doing some TV and radio spots. So we got also some recruitment that came through those vectors. And then for the key informants, those were people who we had picked very, very specifically because of their expertise. So we just identified them and then made one-on-one connections to see if they would be willing to talk to us. For the interviews themselves, for the employee, supervisor, and job coach interviews, we asked participants to tell their stories. This was very story-based. So for the employees and job seekers, we said, think about when you first realized that this was what you wanted to do to where you are now, and tell me the story of how you got there. And then we guided the conversation with questions. And throughout, we wanted to make sure that we got an employment and career history or a history of having supported people in the workplace. We wanted to know about successes and failures, people's workarounds, what influenced their experiences, and that included whether they felt that autism or any other intersectional identities influenced what they had experienced. And then we also asked them specifically what successful employment even meant to them, and for advice that they could give to employees and supervisors. And then in a little wrap up, we just asked them, what would you change if you could go back? What services do you wish for? And then what is the most important message you want to leave the research team with? For data collection, we gave people a choice of email, telephone, video conference, text-based chat, or in person. We have always done this. We've found that giving people a choice of what mode to participate in the research really expands who we can get involved and whose voices are able to be represented in our samples, because it opens up the mode of interaction to multiple communication needs. So people, after they got recruitment information and were interested, they contacted us. We did an online or telephone screen for eligibility, and also for purpose of sampling, because we wanted to make sure that we had enough people who had been successful, and we wanted to make sure that we had enough people who were not white and who were from as wide a variety of professions as we could get. So we looked for those things too in deciding who to invite to the interview. The interviews were conducted by me, so I was a kind of a peer, and a research assistant who had a social work and employment support background. So for analysis, we did a thematic analysis with an inductive approach at a semantic level and a critical realist paradigm, which is really a overly jargony way of saying that we looked in what people said to understand kind of the big meanings across all of interviews. What meaning were people making out of their experiences? And we didn't have an idea of what that would be. We just let it come up to the surface and kind of by itself come out of what we were reading. We took people's words at face value, and the way that we approach the idea of what is reality here, what is real, what is true, is that truth and reality was a co-constructed kind of space of reality between the interviewer and the interviewee. So as we went through and did the analysis, what we were really thinking about and trying to hold in our heads as a focus was, what about people's skilled work experiences impacted the outcomes? This coding was done by me and by a research assistant, Mara Scherer. And for trustworthiness, we had multiple coders, myself and Mira. We had peer debriefing, and we checked in with community members to see about interpretation and what they thought of what was going on. So this is our employee demographics. We talked to 45 autistic employees or job seekers, we got a fairly good range of people as far as our demographic pieces. And then this was pretty exciting. Even though I said we purposefully sampled to make sure we had a broad range of different jobs, we actually didn't have to make any decisions about that because this just sort of happened. The people who contacted us were from a huge range of things: art and entertainment, law, finance, the engineering stuff. We had people from trades. We had people who were professional athletes. It was very, very cool. So anyone who tries to stereotype autistic people as only being in sort of IT type professions, that is not what's going on in the wild. For our employer and job coach demographics, we spoke to 11, 2 also identified as being on the spectrum. We had 4 pairs with employees. The majority were female, all were white, and we talked to 3 job coaches and 8 supervisors. And the key informants just, they kind of came from, as I said, all of these like larger systems that are involved with employment, such as small people who do small business work or disability services and academics and those kinds of things. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the part that I like talking about best, which is sharing with you what we learned and what people had to share with us about their experiences and what we can learn from that. So this is what we learned about people's workplace experiences. So the first really big theme and that came up was the incredibly high stakes of disclosing their diagnosis at work. And these are high stakes in all directions. So for some people, they were the reason why a job worked. They were going to lose a job, they disclosed, and then they got what they needed in order to keep the job. And this could be accommodations, understanding from coworkers, a feeling of acceptance, an ability to unmask and be themselves at work and be accepted for who they were. But it could also be the reason why a job had failed. There were people who felt that they had lost their job because they had disclosed. So that was coming from discrimination, from people not understanding what it meant, not accepting that and pushing back on it even harder. And these extremes happened even for some people, the same person in the same job, just in 2 different states or 2 different job cultures. So it's really connected a lot to the job environment rather than to the person or the field, potentially. So this is a quote from somebody who had one of those really positive experiences with disclosure. And this is an employee who works in higher education. And they said, "I outed myself as autistic to my supervisor about a year in and saw an immediate positive shift in our rapport, my results, and my overall demeanor. I was no longer stressed about passing. He was immediately receptive to my needs. He showed a genuine interest in how my brain works, remained completely respectful of me, and kept an open dialogue with me about how I was doing. In turn, my mood changed and the quality of my work improved dramatically." On the other side of things, this is one of the stories we heard from somebody who works in photography. And they said, "I disclosed my diagnosis and had a group meeting with the 2 supervisors and the unit supervisor. I had to pay $180 out of pocket to have a phone conference with the psychologist who DX'd me and how it affected my employment. After that, they hammered me on the smallest things and I had the union rep knowing about it. She even mentioned how that wouldn't have occurred with other employees. I got nailed for something petty and fired 2 weeks later. I appealed the termination and lost. Disclosing my diagnosis, it has been nothing but hell when it comes to employment." So the next big theme that came up was this idea around unconventional pathways to careers. So many of the people we talked to did not go a traditional path of finding a job, applying for it, having an interview, and going through typical human resource type processes. Instead, they used a strategic, they were very strategic about using their interests or skills or finding special niches that only they could occupy. And people also talked about taking advantage of opportunities that came their way from mentors, family internships, these kind of outside places. Some people also talked about coming into a job in one role, demonstrating skills and being promoted to another. So these were all very twisty ways. And this is a quote from somebody who works in printmaking, where several of those different pathways came together. So they say, the editor showed me some basics of using like graphic design software. And it was really the early days of that stuff publishing. And somehow he and this other guy talked to Student Congress, and they gave them like $10,000 to buy this computer system, which was like going to be a publishing system. So I learned like really early on how to use this stuff when even professional graphic designers didn't know what to do with any of it, and they're just floundering. So that gave me a step into that kind of world. The next big theme was around disconnects with service and support systems. So this was a lot around how a lot of service and support systems will either understand skilled employment like vocational rehabilitation, but not autism, or understand autism like a specialized autism at work program, but doesn't understand skilled work. But there wasn't a lot of intersection of both. So this first quote from somebody in law enforcement is about that case of a program not understanding the skilled part, but getting the disability part. And they say, I was a highly qualified candidate for WRP, which is a government program for people with disabilities positions, but I never received any offers. I later found out the government agencies mostly use disability hiring programs such as WRP to hire employees for unskilled positions. This is a problem since those on the autism spectrum often do much better with positions involving analytical thinking than positions involving unskilled labor. And then the second quote is from the other side of VR that does do things that are related to skilled work, but doesn't always understand the specifics of autism. And this is somebody whose background is in literary arts. And they said, my vocational rehabilitation job developer found a call center position that I think was probably an easy fit for her. Unfortunately, this job was incredibly stressful for me. And then my VR counselor suggested I take Xanax during the day while at work. I eventually gave notice as this was not the right fit for someone with my condition. So our next theme was around mental health challenges from trauma and burnout. And one of the things that ran through these interviews was that people felt that they had a lot more difficulties that came from co-occurring conditions rather than from traits associated with their autism. And people also disclosed to us, unfortunately, really long-term histories of abuse that started very, very early in childhood and extended into the workplace bullying, and harassment. And then, of course, all of the resulting things that happen from that, like difficulty with boundaries, difficulty managing fear of mistreatment at work, people feeling like they can't possibly make any mistake or they're going to get bullied. So that was all a big deal. And here's a quote from somebody who has a background in veterinary science. He talks about some of those things. They say, finding a job has been agony. It hurts so much to put myself out there and be tossed aside. When I found work and tried to keep it, most times I would end up getting bullied by people there. I have a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder issues with bullying, so I do not take it well, and it leads to bad employment outcomes. On a happier note, people really also talked about autistic advantages in the workplace. And this might be related to special interests or advantages of their autistic traits, or just the advantage that having lived experience gave. They talked about how they got increased skills, it made them love a job more or really facilitate their success. So here is a quote from someone in paraeducation who says, "From the people I've chosen to share my diagnosis with, it's usually a positive response. Like they know me from seeing how I work with kids with disabilities, and they're like, oh, that would explain why you're really able to zero in on that and use rapport with that kid who's hard to reach." And I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess so. I'm using my superpowers. So this is another direction where those advantages came into play. Someone from nursing who says, in the course of my education, anatomy, physiology, pathology, and symptom pattern recognition became a special interest. This meant I could focus my autistic superpowers on succeeding at work. And lastly, the last big theme to really come out was the really complex dimensions of discrimination that were at play in people's experiences. So, of course, a big part of it was autism related discrimination and ableism. And this really influenced people's disclosure decisions, their mental health, their ability to trust, many more things. And remember, I said that there was somebody, at least one person who had talked about getting very different responses to disclosure. And this is a quote from that person. So they had some very positive work experiences in one place, gone to a different place, and been treated very, very, very poorly. And this was kind of their conclusion after that experience was, I've acquiesced to the worldview that we don't live in a post-ableism world. And so once I acquiesced to that view, I've had to treat my disability like it's a thing that should be shamed, even though I don't believe that. I realized that once I acted like that, I was able to work a lot better. This was someone in the social work field. All of that becomes even more complicated when people also have racial, ethnic, gender, or sexual minorities, or additional layers of marginalization. It adds more layers of discrimination, and it amplified people's risk around managing multiple disclosures. There were people who talked about, well, I already can't pass in these marginalized ways, but I can in these, so I have to hide this part of myself in order to not be, and this is not, you can see this is not good. So here is a quote from a person of color who earlier in the interview, she had talked about how she typically discloses her autism, even though, quote, this can cause people to be a little worried about hiring me. And later on, she starts discussing the additional layers of complexity that she needs to navigate. So she says, after coming out trans, I was told that I was, quote, fired for being gay. I also acknowledged that my privilege as a white passing person has also helped me. I feel like if I had the double whammy of being a trans woman and a person of color, I would have almost no chance of getting a job. As it is, I only have a few strikes against me in the, quote, not employable identities column. And she worked in social services. Okay, so I'm going to move on into the next section now, which is success indicators. And I got pretty interested in success indicators because, that like placement in a job and lasted 3 months in a job as indicators of success. I personally kind of want the bar to be a little higher in my own life, but nobody's really looked into like, what does success even mean for people on the spectrum in skilled environments? So that is what we asked people. And what they told us about was that successful meant opportunities for professional growth. It meant good work-life balance, even if that looks a little bit different for them than it does for some people. Some people were talking about how working part-time is what they really needed in order to manage their disability and live happy lives. Financial independence, of course, having a sense of community at work, feeling like they're a part of the work environment and the team, feeling valued for their skills and their contribution, doing meaningful work, so doing something that matters in the world, and being part of an accepting job work culture, being able to be themselves and to know that that was okay and safe. So these things are, pretty typical, actually. These are not autism specific things. These are absolutely consistent with indicators of success in the general population. And we already have tools and ways to measure them. And I I have to admit I'm a little bit I have a little bit of a personal stake in this one too, partially because I've been a recipient of vocational rehabilitation services and they have not really attended to any of these other things that would be considered successful. But I remember a very formative experience of sitting at an autism employment conference, and the person was talking about how great it was that they had placed this person in a warehouse job, and it was, his first job, and it was a great success. And oh, stand up, she said. And this poor person, probably mortified, stood up while people clapped and cheered. And he happened to be sitting right in front of me. So after that, as he sat down, I heard him muttering under his breath, "But I have a degree in psychology." And I really think that people who are within disability and autism service agencies need to start thinking differently about how we approach the autism specific frames for success. And it's not just about getting any job, it's about the things that anybody would think of as being good about a job. So I really encourage any of you today who are listening, who have some ability to influence those parts of the systems, to start thinking a bit more broadly about what successful employment means for autistic people. And we're currently working on some adaptive standardized measures that will get at some of those typical constructs. Because like I say, these are not unusual things that are unknown in the literature. They're just not usually applied to this population. So I will end this section with a quote because I love the quotes. They're the best. And this is from the paraeducator again, who says, "It really helps if it means something. If I feel like what I'm doing is meaningful to someone, because I mean, money is important too, and also a job that has an opportunity for growth that can lead to something else, which because people change over their lives, and what's good for you at one point is not always. Don't want to do the same thing for 20 years. And if it uses my skills skills that I'm proud of, I guess there's a bit of like recognition. Recognition's important. And I don't want to just be like a cog in the machine. Like that sounds boring." So what helped people to get to those success points, and what got in the way? So I'll share a little bit about what we learned there. Employment history played a really big role in people's experiences. If they had a history of failure, that tended to compound, so every failure made the next it harder to get past and go into the next thing, whereas early successes would make a virtuous cycle and help people to really have increased self-efficacy and a lot more success. And this was also true of where people were in their sort of age range, where people who were fresh out of their training tended to be very different from people who had been trying to get a job for 25, 30 years. I remember talking to somebody who had just finished their training and had applied for like 150 jobs or something and not gotten any of them. And it's like, how are you feeling about that? And they said, well, it happens to everyone. There's just, a lot of people who are looking for work, and I'll get something and it'll be great. And that was a very different attitude than the people who had been really beaten down. Job entry barriers, as I talked about before, those traditional hiring processes, people really struggled with, in particular, interviews, getting through interviews and not being able to show what they could do. Having to rely on things that weren't their actual job skills to get jobs. Facilitators, as I had kind of gone over, were these non-traditional or creative paths through internships, mentorships, relationships, skills demonstrations, and job carving. So employers who were willing to say, oh, well, you're super good at this. Let's make that your job and give these other pieces to someone else. And luckily, those are some things that people who work in employment programs have some ability to influence. Workplace climate was a big deal. Barriers were pressure to mask autism or other identities, and lack of accommodations. And things that facilitated were people feeling accepted, job cultures that accommodated and allowed people to be themselves, including it allowed them to safely disclose, and also that that really normalized disability in the workplace, so that this was just stuff that happened and they were not feeling singled out. So workplace structures were a big contributor to barriers and facilitators. Rigid workplaces were a huge problem. And this one kind of makes me laugh, because there's this idea that from some people that we like everything to be absolutely rigid all the time, which may be true, but we want control of that rigidity. So the things that really facilitated were allowing the employee flexibility and control over their own schedule, over their job tasks, when they did them, what they did, and over their own professional development, where they wanted to grow and what they wanted to do. So the idea was not like, no, I don't want structure. It was, I need my structure, and I need you as the employer to be flexible enough to give that to me. Things that didn't help were, you have to be here at this time, and you have to do it this way, and you have to do it my way, allowing people to find their own zone. And then the last big barrier facilitator category was really around relationships and communication, which is probably not surprising to anyone here. Barriers were lack of clarity, uncertainty. What am I doing? I don't know the expectations. I don't know if I'm doing it right. I don't know if people are happy with me. And then, as I talked before, discrimination, bullying, isolation, being kind of not and feeling like there's no one in your workplace who you can trust or talk to or come to for information or advice. And things that helped were having really clear expectations, getting really specific, concrete feedback, including about things you're doing well, and mentors and trusted allies. So this was, people talked about having like genuine friendships and genuine mutual respect for each other, and that it's not just like, I'm going to pat you on the head and say good job, but there's an actual rapport between people in the workplace. Really helped. Okay, so strategies and advice. How do we do that? And I'm sure you've already thought of a bunch of different things that you can maybe do to help facilitate better work experiences. I'm going to just start with, that was like a lot of information that I just dumped out there. So I'm going to just summarize it up in this diagram. In the middle, we've got all of those dimensions of success. So professional growth, work-life balance, financial independence, sense of workplace community, feeling valued, feeling like you're doing meaningful work, and feeling accepted in the workplace. And then kind of around that, we've got safe, effective disclosure, a culture that normalizes and accommodates autism and disability, genuine relationships with mentors and supervisors, explicitly valuing people's skills, being sensitive to multiple marginalization, being, if you're the employee, trauma informed and safety focused around your self-advocacy, having autistic and professional work informed support services that link to and support appropriate jobs, clear direct communication for supervisors, trauma informed mental health support, flexible hiring, and job crafting. So those are just how some of those themes and things we learned, highlights of how they fit around. And this all to us suggests systems-focused strategies. So a really systems-focused approach to autism employment services that first of all engages multiple stakeholders. So it includes supervisors, coworkers, job developers. It's not just the autistic person. But it is developed in partnership with or directed by the autistic person because it's their job and their life and they know best what their work is about. And this is really consistent with legal definitions of disability discrimination in that we need to not focus all of the effort for remediation of difficult situations on the autistic employee or job seeker. And in that vein, the advice and the strategies that I'm going to give you first are ones that really go out to supervisors and people in the workplace. And these came from supervisors and job coaches as well. I told you we talked to some of them, and these were, when we said, what helped you succeed? These were some of the things that they told us. So be flexible and creative about hiring and carving job tasks to fit skills and passions. Normalize and accommodate disability and autistic differences. Take a trauma-informed approach and support employee mental health. There's a lot of great resources that are coming out these days for trauma-informed approaches to everything that, that people can readily access. Focus on employee strengths and abilities. Provide authentic, reciprocal mentorship, friendship. Think about people as people. Communicate very clearly about expectations. Be very direct and also very compassionate when giving feedback. And respect and value your employees and communicate that very, very explicitly. Say, you're doing a good job. I really respect your work. So say and also do. And then I put this on a separate slide because, as I've been kind of saying all along, that one of the things we learned was that disclosure just was such a big deal. I think we need to really start educating employers about disclosure, which doesn't just help autistic people, but everybody with a disability. Participants that we talked to were very, very, very aware of the high risk and potentially high reward nature of disclosure. And they made very complex risk assessments in kind of a vacuum about that. So this was advice that an autistic participant is giving to employers. And they said, recognize that the employee may be taking a massive personal risk in making their disclosure, and that they must have calculated that the extra measure of vulnerability prompted by the disclosure was worth it. That's somebody from electrical engineering. And now here's a little section. This is this part is peer advice. So this is when we asked people, what advice would you give to others like yourself? These are some sample quotes from some of the big categories of advice we got. One of the biggest pieces of advice that people gave was to know yourself. So this is someone from chemical engineering who said in all caps, know yourself. And then they said, I know what I like, dislike, am capable of, absolutely cannot deal with, what I need from a boss, what I want from a job. I know who and what I am. This is absolutely the key to success. It may take time and searching, but it's worth it. So this is about finding a good job fit for strengths, interests, and also a bunch of people gave advice to research employers because they're not just shopping for an employee, you are shopping for an employer. And so this is somebody from the justice system who talked about their journey. They say, think realistically about what jobs require and if it is something you really want to or can do. For example, since middle school, my dream job was to become a firefighter. I did my EMT license and volunteered at a fire station only to discover that it was probably not the best fit. I love the actual work involved in being a firefighter, but the little things like always going on calls to strange unknown houses and environments was hard. So was talking to strangers and touching them. And the social demands of station life. The real deal breaker was that calls came in at all hours of the day and night, making no schedule or routine possible. I could have been a firefighter, but the stress of all that above stuff probably would have made me unhappy. I think really sitting down and considering all aspects of a job is important when trying to decide which jobs to pursue. There's also a lot of peer advice around healthy boundaries, advocating for accommodations, and really strengthening that notion that you deserve a healthy work environment where you can be valued for who you are. We don't have to take abuse in the workplace. And this is from a robotics engineer who's just sort of talking about taking care of yourself at your job. And they say, monitor yourself for signs of burnout and act sooner rather than later. I suspect we are more vulnerable than average to overextending ourselves. We need to remember to eat, drink water, and sleep regularly. And we need to learn to say no to avoid overcommitment. If you are in a workplace where they do take a more formalized approach to accommodations, the main advice I would have is to be persistent in getting what you need. So we did learn, the focus of this study was not on how to engage with businesses, but we did learn a bit about that, especially from our key informants. And so these are just a couple of bullet points if you want them in your toolbox, advice about engaging with businesses and employers. So this would be kind of most useful, I think, for job coaches or programs that are looking to engage with more businesses. So you'll need to be very creative and flexible with the employers and provide ongoing education to them. Unfortunately, because capitalism, you need to appeal to their bottom line. And that community connections and small business relationships can provide really unique opportunities because small businesses sometimes can be more flexible and personable and direct than big corporations where there's a lot of gatekeeping going on. So that is the main what we learned, and I always get a little teary-eyed when I think about these interviews because people gave us such rich, amazing information and really put themselves out there to give us this information. So I'm just going to do a little bit of wrap up now with some housekeeping and some recommendations that we have for all of you. So just every study has limitations. This is normal, it's a thing. Some of the bigger limitations of the study, this was an exploratory qualitative study. It was not designed to demonstrate causality, efficacy, or effectiveness. So this says nothing about like, if you do these things people say, if you will have results. This is just what people said gave them results. It is not a representative sample. There are definitely people whose voices were left out of this. It was not intended to be generalizable. It's a qualitative study, so we were much more interested in understanding in-depth experiences from as wide a range of different people as we could, rather than something that we could go then and generalize to a population. The study was in the United States only, and people needed a formal diagnosis. Things could be very different for people outside of the country or who can't take advantage of legal rights with a diagnosis to get things like accommodations. And then our supervisor sample was a bit small. We kind of had a hard time letting supervisors know that we were not going to ask them actually questions about their employees, but about their own experiences. And those that we did get were mostly from STEM fields, from science, technology, engineering, and math. So supervisors who work with somebody in a design studio or something might have different experiences and advice. So recommendations, we recommend that people explore customizable, multifaceted employment service interventions. There are some of them out there. There are some components potentially from customized employment and supported employment that could be taken out and applied to existing programs that might be helpful in some of the job carving or job fit aspects or mental health support aspects. We recommend people consider changes to service systems to better meet the needs of people with skilled training. That's a really big gap. Finding businesses that do skilled training, incorporating that, and then dealing with some of the complexity really needs to be done. taking a more holistic view of autistic employees, including being really sensitive to the fact that most of us have experienced discrimination, trauma, and may have mental health conditions that are related to that come into play in work settings in our lives. And focus more research and resources on disclosure because it's such a pivotal item, and there's very little out there for it. We recommend that employment researchers and service programs begin including employment outcome measures that are related to things like job satisfaction, work-life balance, professional growth, all of these other constructs that are much more well-known within employment, occupational psychology and such. And to work with autism and skilled employment research and in practice, really think about conducting that in collaboration with the autistic community. We know what we want, we know what we need, we have that lived experience, and that's a piece of expertise that a lot of outsiders don't actually have, that can be really useful in developing new interventions and programs that are actually effective in leading to successful employment. We have a few recommendations that are specifically related to intersecting marginalization and intersecting identities. So first, focusing on autism or disability alone in interventions may be overly simplistic and marginalizing. It's not always just about the disability, it might be much more about something else. Discussions about disclosure strategies and resources need to take the possible disclosure of multiple identities into account. Unsiloing employment research and diversity programs that address other vectors of marginalization may benefit the autism field. So thinking outside of the autism box, there's actually a lot of work that's been done on this stuff that can be pulled in a transdisciplinary way. Autistic people, employers, and support agencies and systems also need to be aware of the additional burden of multiple marginalization in the workplace and in life. And you can't just ignore that when you're interacting with somebody who has intersecting identities. And you yourself, if you have intersecting identities, take care of yourself and be aware that these issues are out there, which I'm sure you are. So the next steps for us, I am working on some disclosure tools and, like I said, some work on adapting standardized measures that can be used for evaluating successful interventions. I'm also currently working on intervention development and testing that out in the community based on a lot of these things that we learned. And then, of course, getting the word out so that others can use these findings and make use of this important information, which is why we are here together today. So I am now the end of things. This is my last slide. I want to say thank you to everybody who sat through my hour monologue. And I also really want to say thank you to the whole AASPIRE team whose work this is, and to our research participants who shared their wisdom and their experience with us. Shameless self-promotion plug. I'm the associate editor of Autism in Adulthood. It's an academic journal. Please consider submitting. We currently have an open call that is due December 1st, so it's a little tight by the time you actually hear this for articles related to intersectional experiences, but we take general articles all the time. Here's my contact information, and if you want to keep up to date on my research, I have a newsletter and you can subscribe off my website. And at this point, I will just leave the slide up. If we have any more time, I will sit and stare awkwardly, but you can use the chat to ask me questions.